Verbal reasoning has been the lowest scoring section on the UCAT basically every single year since it's run. So, what can you do about it, especially on a 1 month deadline? Well, these are three strategies that I think are probably new, are probably some new things that you can try and then think about how they interact with your questions. And they should be pretty quick to implement and able to boost your score to the next level. So, I want to start with macro questions and micro questions. So, some questions ask about macro concepts. These are not isolated to specific sentences, but have more to do with the gist of the passage. And there's not really a question type that you can use to predict this. Obviously, there's questions like what's the main summary of the passage, where the whole thing is a macro question. But there's certain questions that basically ask about the gist of a paragraph or the gist of the whole text and can be answered based on what you're sort of reading and your interpretation on the main ideas are on what the main ideas are versus the questions that really require really specific detail and can be pinpointed to a specific line. Often the correlation would be that things with keywords are to do with the micro and without keywords are to do with the macro, but that doesn't quite fit the whole time. The practical tip here is if you see a new question, try and get the vibe whether it is a macro question or a micro question. Because if you've read the passage first, the macro questions you can be more confident just answering straight away. Whereas the micro questions, which require more specific attention to the detail in each sentence, might require rereading, or you just need to be very confident with the specific sentence that the question is testing. So the macro questions you can make a bit more of a loose inference on and pick an answer and move on. They require less checking into the text. And they're often the trap because people go looking in the passage when there's not necessarily that exact sentence that relates to the question as you would expect in a micro question. If you're interested in an example, a simple thing might be which of these conclusions may be drawn, and they'll have general conclusions about the whole passage for a couple, whereas a couple will be very specific. Certain person was born in 1966 versus the contributions that certain person made to sport were significant or were understated. So it's more whether the phrase in itself is general or specific. Number two, pivot words and anticipating the tricks within the question. So it's not enough to just read the question and look at the text. Once you've read the question, try and think about the hidden tricks, the hidden assumptions that that question is getting you to make. And this goes beyond just simple words like, does the question have all, must, only versus could, can, some? There's certain words that really are the focal point of whether that question is true or false. For example, if I said, during this person's time as president, the economy rose gradually. The key word there is gradually, right? Because the economy may have risen during the person's time, but if it rose suddenly, then it's false. Or if it doesn't have that word gradually, then it's can't tell. So if it just says, President X had successful economic policies which led to a growth in the economy, it would be can't tell. If it was rapid growth, it'd be false. And if it says gradual growth or steady growth, um, or like a long-term growth, then maybe you can say gradual being true. So pay attention as you read the question, try and anticipate what are the actual tricks that are at play. Is there some way in the phrasing that you can tell this word's important, or it's more likely to be false or can't tell based on this specific word? So as you're reading the answer options, try and think about the possible ways they're going to try and trick you. Because if you identify, oh, there's a couple of adjectives here, or here they're combining two sentences and they've put a because in the middle. So that's the point that I need to test. That will make it a lot easier rather than just viewing the statement as a blanket statement. So put your own emphasis on specific words that are the key words in deciding whether that statement is correct or incorrect, or true, false, or can't tell. And finally, is the distinction between inferences and assumptions. And it all ties back into whether it's aligning with the gist or on a specific point. But you can make inferences. If there's evidence in the text that supports a general claim, that is okay to do. And that's often what's required for the correct answers. Often, when you think an answer is right based on the wording, you can have confidence to pick that answer even if you don't necessarily find a specific piece of evidence in the text. And this is particularly the case for inference-based questions and macro questions, which are often overlapping. The assumptions people make are often on specific things, and they're often on things where it doesn't have to be that way. There's a reasonable alternate case that still holds up, for example. And it's often some third party link that people get involved with. So, for example, people will say that let's say smoking causes lung cancer, and let's say alcohol is a risk factor for lung cancer, and then people will say smoking causes people to drink alcohol, and that is the assumption, if that makes sense. So just bear that in mind. Or maybe a better example is, lung cancer rates are high in England. Smoking causes lung cancer, therefore smoking has is high is a high rate in England. So it doesn't have to be that way. There could be a low smoking rate in England and still be large proportions of people with lung cancer. So if you can come up with a feasible case where that doesn't work, or there's a feasible explanation other than the principal explanation, then it indicates there's an assumption at place. Whereas inferences are more general, if that makes sense. And you can have supporting pieces of evidence. And if there's no contradicting evidence for the inference, then you can have the confidence to say yes. Now, if you'd like more detail on any of these topics, there's a few things that I would suggest. Number one, with regard to practice, try and do some mini mocks or the equivalent of free practice sessions, which are 44 questions in 22 minutes. Your score should be aiming for something in the 34 to 38 range. That's pretty reasonable for most people, and that will get you into that 700 range overall. Hopefully, if you've clicked the link in description, you will have access to some of my PDFs, which you can use for further strategies. And I've also done a verbal reasoning workshop, which is basically a 1.5 hour class for charity with my best strategies in verbal reasoning and everything I think you need to know before the test. Either of these things, both free resources and the workshop, can be accessed if you click the link in the description. So that's the next place to go. If you have any other questions with regard to UCAT or verbal reasoning, simply write them in the comments, or you'll find my email via the link in the description. Thanks very much, guys, and I hope to see you in a future video. Cheers.